Today on Muscle Car, everybody knows that putting fire-breathing, pavement-pounding power down into a rear end that's built for grocery retrieval is a recipe for a phone call to a tow truck. Today, we show you how to build your own beefy GM 12-bolt for a fraction of the cost of buying one. Then a cool trick to install coil springs.
Hey folks, glad to see you in the shop with us today. We've been chipping away at our '69 Camaro COPO tribute car, and before you know it, we'll be ready to drop in that Chevrolet Performance ZL1 engine. We've partnered up with Chevrolet Performance to pay homage to an iconic piece of American muscle, the '69 ZL1 427 Camaro, of which only 69 were ever made. Our Camaro will get this number 426 out of 427 ZL1 anniversary big block as a power plant. And we're building the rest of the car around it to be as close as we can get to the original COPO. You can see we've got a good bit accomplished on our '69 Camaro. Pretty much from the firewall forward, it's all been disassembled. We're gonna reuse a good bit of that because it's the same stuff that a COPO would have originally had on it. But that's enough about all that. We'll get on it a little later on. We also finished up patching up on the quarter panels where some rust had started to take a hold, in addition to getting the floor pan squared away. The rear end that's tied into this Chevy is the small 10-bolt setup, which is perfectly fine for the 307 that this car has always been running. But the GM big power cars of the day were running a 12-bolt setup that was more capable of handling the abuse. So to keep our Camaro on the right track, we need to install a 12-bolt. Problem is those things can go for up to $2 grand just for an empty housing. I've seen it at the swap meets, but I believe I can beat all that. Go from brake drum to brake drum with upgraded parts for less cash. So this is my idea, is to take a 12-bolt rear out of an Impala, chop it down, narrow it up so it's the same width as the one for the Camaro. That way we'll have us a stronger unit when we're all said and done, and it'll be easier on your wallet too. These lug nuts haven't been off in who knows how long. So a little Royal Purple Max film will go a long way in getting them off the studs. The next rusty old part that's stuck on the rear is the brake drums. Sometimes you can save them. That's not looking like it's gonna be the case here though. Well, we're fixing to try something that normally you don't really do. Sometimes you got to. We're gonna try to split this brake drum to release that pressure in there. We'll have to sacrifice that old brake drum, but I don't think it's any good nohow. Now you can see it, all the pitting and garbage and stuff down here that's fell out of that drum. The chances are that drum was way too rusty to even fool with. So yeah, we did destroy it, but it was already a piece of scrap iron before we got started. Whew, I'm out of shape. Yeah, see what I mean? Now sometimes if you can't get the brake drums off, it's actually corrosion built up around this stub on the axle shaft. You can scrape this stuff off. I've had to file it off. Make it a little easier to get them things out. Definitely can hurt, but instead of working with this thing, trying to save all this stuff, we're not gonna use it anyways, so I'm just gonna bust it off like I did the other side. See, as I'm pushing this brake drum off, you can see this is actually holding itself in. That's what I was talking about. Now sometimes removing brake cables, they can be quite a chore because you got to push this little finger down, that little finger down, and there's another one back off in there. Cool little trick to use is a wrench. All you got to do is slide it on there, tap it down, that compresses those fingers. Pick it, cable, back out. Now we don't get to use the torch a whole lot here in the shop, but it's one of those type of tools that definitely has its uses. Now using the torch, there's actually a kind of a technique that I like to use whenever cutting off brackets. What you want to do is to pay attention to the flame coming out of the tip and angle it so that you're just cutting across the weld that attaches the bracket to the rear. If you try to turn it, it can actually dig into the tube, and then you have to go back and grind and weld and fix all that to make it look like something. So just pay attention to what's going on. Another thing you want to keep in mind if you're cutting pieces off and they're going to fall, make sure you pay attention to where your hose is at, because you don't want this to fall and chop it in two.
Chopping up a rear end housing can be intimidating. Next, we've got a great little piece of engineering that makes it super simple to make this affordable modification.
Hey guys, I'm glad you made it back from the break. While you were gone, I went ahead and removed the axle shafts and the backing plates from our 12 bolt and the ones out of our 10 bolt. I wanted to show you the difference in the size of them so you can kind of see what the strength difference of the two is. Now this little greasy one, it's the factory 28 spline that came out of the Camaro. This 30 spline, you can definitely see why they would have put that in the higher horsepower cars. If you look down here to where the bearing actually runs out toward the wheels, it's a lot easier to see the difference in the size of the two. But that's no problem at all, because we got this Moser engineering axle from Classic Industries. It's the correct spline, it's the correct length to fit our 69 Camaro, and it's a lot stronger than this factory setup. A weak point of this traditional unit is right here. A C-clip actually slides in to keep the axle from sliding out of the housing. Now, if you start putting this type of setup under some heavy lateral movement, they have been known to break. Also, if you're drag racing some and you twist an axle out, the shaft is going to run out from under the car and you're fixing to go for one heck of a ride. The really neat part of this Moser setup is right here. This big bearing and axle housing end allow us to eliminate the C-clip altogether. In addition to letting us narrow the housing easily without having to deal with a whole bunch of just extra fab work. This prefab piece is the part that allows you to do this at home. It's not all that bad. Let me show you how to do it. Let's find out how wide the Impala rear is. That was 58 3/8. Our original Camaro housing is 54 3/8, so we've got to shorten it about 2 inches per side. That doesn't mean you can just chop off 2 inches on each side, because you've got to account for this thing, the axle flange end. If you just cut the 2 inches and welded this back on, it puts you at almost exactly where we started. So that's 2 3/8, so we'll just add that to the 2 inches on each side, chop it off, we'll be ready to go. All right, we got a mark 4 3/8. Then I'm going to use a handy little old hose clamp. These things work really nice for keeping your nice straight edge. Now you may have to wiggle it around a little bit to get it exactly where you want it, but that's the beauty of that clamp. It's easy to move. Make sure it's tight so it don't wiggle around on you. Now I'm using a reciprocating saw because a lot of you guys at home would have something like this. Now you could use a cutoff wheel, but you don't want to use a torch, because if you start doing that, you'd have to come back and dress all that up with a grinder. So we'll see how this works. Now we need to level the other axle end, that way we know how to clock the other side. The reason we do that is that way we can match the left and the right side to make sure that the brakes are in the proper location. With our mark made, the next thing we're going to do is to bevel this axle tube a lot like this axle end. That way it ensures a good solid weld. Next thing we're going to do is slide the axle shaft in and go ahead and spline it into the carrier. That way we'll use the axle shaft to help locate this axle end. You can see that it's got up and down and front to rear type movement on it, and you want it to be in the happy medium of all four. That way the bearings don't have preload already on them. Now with that tacked into place, if you slide the axle out, you want it to have pretty much no binding at all. You can see that we're pretty much right there at it. Now it's time to burn it in.
Coming up, Tommy shows us a down-home method for setting your pinion angle and bracket placement.
Hey guys, we're on the downhill slide of building our 12 bolt for our Camaro project. We've got the axle tubes narrowed down and the axle ends welded up. We're ready to move on to putting the leaf spring perches on that we got from Classic Industries. Now we went ahead and removed the old rear out from under our Camaro because it's got some information that's a whole lot easier to copy sitting out here on the table. Now you may be noticing that there's a little bit of difference between the two. That's because of the original one that came out from under our Camaro is thinner because it came with the mono leaf or single leaf spring, where the COPOs, they had a multi-leaf pack. That's the reason why they're thicker. Now my old 2x4s here may look a little primitive, but hey, it works, because what we've got to do is clock these things correctly onto the rear by measuring the pinion angle. First thing you need to do is pick up the housing, set the perch up under it. Now we need to measure from where the backing plate goes on to the leaf spring perch, and then duplicate that on the other rear. Shoot, we hit it dead on. We're almost ready to set the pinion angle, but first we need to do a little prep work to ensure a good solid weld. So we need to mark this thing, take it back apart, do a little grinding, and then we'll be just about ready to burn some wire. The reason you do this is so that you're not welding over top of rust, because welding and rust just don't play well together. So there's no reason to put your life in the hands of a nasty rusty weld. Once it's ground down, put your brackets back on, double check the measurements, and call it good. All right, we're ready to set the pinion angle. First, I'm gonna measure the angle of the 10 bolt so we know exactly where we need to be. Next, we're gonna put that measurement over here on top of our new one. You wanna do that way you make sure you don't have any drive shaft or oiling issues on the inside of the case. Once your angle is set, you can tack the brackets in place, triple check your placement, and then burn them in. I find it a lot better to flip the housing over so you can get to the work surface easily. Now, whenever you're working with the backing plates on these 12 bolts, they got a couple different patterns, and this is the difference in the two. They've got one that's called the truck pattern, which the upper and lower holes are the same width, where on the car pattern, the upper holes are wider than the bottom two are. I'm gonna use a couple of bolts to hold my backing plate into place. Problem is our backing plate hole is a little bit smaller than the big bearing setup that we're going with now, but it's no real big issue. So we'll just take a pick, set it here on the inside, kind of scribe or scratch. Now you can see the amount that we've got to take off around the perimeter of this thing to enlarge it just a bit. So now we've got to go get up close and personal, some cuddle time with a carbide bit. All right, our next step is to toss in a set of 410 gears and a polish unit that we got from Classic Industries. Now, you guys have seen us do this a number of times, so we're not gonna fool with showing that to you right now. But if you're interested in seeing it, just go over to PowerBlockTV.com and you can find it on there. But as for now, I've got a little bit of work to do, so if you guys wanna stick around, Mank's got something he'd like to show you.
Nobody likes compressing coil springs, but up ahead, we've got a great way to do it easily and safely.
Hey guys, welcome back. Well, Tommy's got the 12-bolt rear axle of our COPO Camaro taken care of, and once the firewall and the belly of the car get painted, it'll be ready to install. Well, I guess since he did the back half of the car, I got to get busy on the front, so let's get going. We're going to use the factory subframe that we took out of the car to keep it as close as we can to the original COPO Camaro. Once we detached it from the car and took off all of its related components, we took it to Lebanon, Tennessee to our friends at Blast from the Past. They completely blasted it for us with media and gave us a clean slate to work with. After we retrieved our front end and all of its parts, we rounded up our resident paint gunslinger, Tommy, and he camped out in the spray booth for a little while and got after it with some satin black paint, which will help us keep the factory look we were chasing after. For now, let's get all of this back on the front end and we'll have one less thing to worry about. Okay guys, as you can see, we're getting ready to put the lower control arms in the car along with the coil springs. And if you've done this, you know it's not a fun job. Most coil spring compressors are nothing more than externally mounted threaded rods. And sometimes they can be dangerous. What I like to do is take a single piece of threaded rod, if you have the room and the availability of space to do so, and put a single rod up through the center of the coil spring and bring the A-arm straight up, which will keep it from going anywhere should any type of accident try to happen. It'll all be contained inside of itself. The reason I like to do it this way whenever possible is I can pull the coil spring straight up into itself instead of pulling it at an angle, which is where the danger lies. It makes it a lot safer. put a call into Classic Industries so we could get our hands on some disc brake spindles to replace the factory-style drum ones. It's time to put a steering box in our subframe. We've opted for a 16:1 manual unit that we got from Classic Industries. We've decided to go with the 16:1 unit because this is going to be a performance-oriented car. We want to be able to maintain tight steering control, and this one turns more quickly than the 20 and 24:1 models they also offer. These 11-inch rotors also came from Classic Industries. It's part of the disc brake conversion kit that includes everything you need to make the complete changeover from drum to disc. Well, there you go. The basic front end rebuild we've done on our '69 Camaro, including suspension, brakes, and steering, are pretty similar to most cars from the muscle car era. With a little help from Classic Industries, we've done some upgrades that allowed us to maintain the stock look we were looking for, but give us the performance we were after. If you've got any questions about anything you saw on the show today,
Go over to PowerBlockTV.com.